Hey everybody, it's Sterlin Mosley of Empathy Architects,
And I'm Addonizio.
and so in this video we wanted to, we get a lot of questions and comments about what is this version of the Enneagram you're teaching, and how come I've never heard this? And we like to teach the Enneagram from kind of what we think is sort of the original or kind of gems of the perspective that kind of disseminated down, and much of it has gotten confused or lost in translation. And we, as some of you may know, we came to the Enneagram, 20 years ago now, when we were
Yeah.
in high school, and studying, books. And it wasn't really until we went to conferences and finally went to a conference and met our mentor and teacher, Katherine Fauvre, who we have with us here today. And so we're going to be kind of interviewing her and talking to her about how she came about her research findings that really informed a lot of most of what we do now. And we really value her perspective because it was really holistic and synthesized not only different systems together, but just it really it just made a lot of sense, the way that she understood and taught the Enneagram system. So we want to share her with you. She is a master Enneagram teacher in her own right.
And the only Enneagram teacher that has studied with every major school
Yeah.
and also with Naranjo. So we're
Yeah.
really excited to hear what she has to say.
Yeah. So we are going to delve right in with you, Katherine, and talk a little bit about how you came, how you found the Enneagram, what piqued your interest in it, and then how you began your research from there.
So for me, it was a logical evolution from being a very young manager at the age of 20 and being promoted at a time when they couldn't ask your age. Otherwise, they wouldn't have promoted me at 20. But being an 8, I was self-possessed and just took charge and did what I was supposed to execute, but didn't always do it in a diplomatic way, at least not diplomatic enough. And so I was promoted, but told I needed to take management type training classes, things that would help me become more professional, and so that people would want to follow me, that I was a natural leader, but that people had to want to follow me. And I remember thinking at the time, whoa, is this a compliment or is this a criticism? And they said both. And from that point on, I took everything that was available in the 70s, 80s, and then went on to be in my own business and ended up specializing because of that information in the internal and external sense of self. And that was as an image consultant. So whether I was working with teaching you how to be self-possessed or what have you, I used it, came across the Enneagram, and it was, whoa, this clearly defines what I saw in people. I had about 7 or 8 different types of people. And then there were some variables that I also saw, but they didn't seem as complete, which I now know are the instincts. But I didn't know the full why they were doing it. It was like, well, haven't you learned that yet? Is kind of what I'm thinking. Oh, you're still afraid? Why are you still afraid? We've gone over that. But what I learned is, people are meant to have these constructs based on a defense strategy. So I was all in. And that was 35 years ago. And from that point forward, I voraciously wanted to learn everything I could. But unfortunately, there were no books published. It was people teaching, and there were some good teachers like Tom Condon being one of them, but and others in Berkeley. But what was available were the notes that disseminated down from Father Robert Oakes, that attended Claudio Naranjo's first training and disseminated the Enneagram through the Catholic pipeline. And there was Kathy Spieth, who had been Naranjo's girlfriend at the time, and also an avid seeker herself, and had grown up in the Gurdjieff work. And her notes were amazing. And then later, I discovered that a friend of mine had attended her year-long training, and I got a whole notebook of notes and really saw important factors about the Enneagram that later were not taught. They were lost in the dissemination of the Enneagram. So after the 1994 Enneagram conference that David Daniels organized at Stanford University, I had a chance to see teachers that I wasn't aware of the details of their teaching. And it was pretty extraordinary. And I saw just a huge distinction between those that had come down through Father Robert Oakes and those that somehow had learned from Kathy Spieth, or those who had learned from those who had learned from Kathy Spieth. So Naranjo and Kathy Spieth to Kathy Spieth on. And the huge distinction was the instincts, which is probably where you want to go in terms of the stackings and the types and the tritypes and the instinctual stackings. So that was 9 years after knowing the Enneagram. And I was really pursuing that question with everyone I met at the conference. And someone from Berkeley said, oh, those are east of the Great Divide and west of the Great Divide, meaning those who had learned the subtypes and those who had not. And the definitions of type were very different. Like, how do you explain a 4 and a sexual 4, or an emotional person, or a person that's focused on their twinship and are willing to, in a way, surrender their type in service of their, tight, close, significant other without the instincts. And from that, I decided to, I was on the group planned the 1996 conference, the first IEA conference, that was intended to bring the authors together and come up with a more consistent definition of the types. I was like, good luck. But what did come out of it was that it became very clear that you had to know the instincts, because Naranjo had begun adding those. Now, as far as people understood, he'd completely understood the whole concept and added it, which wasn't quite true according to Naranjo. He said he had come up with common archetypes that he had begun to notice, but that he didn't really know all of them at the same level, and therefore made changes over the years and wasn't really focused on them. He just liked the ways he could quickly see a doubter, which is a 6, or the, and the social 6, it's a more Prussian 6, what have you. But that's how I became interested. And then I decided, I got to surrender to learning these different views, and began 3 certifications simultaneously with Helen Palmer and David Daniels, with Don Riso and Rusty Hudson, and with, I knew them as Ted Dobson and Kathy Hurley. Dobson went on to become Donson, if you're ever confused. When you see it written in literature, there aren't typos. He changed his name in about 2004, actually. But as I was doing that, I also wanted to see for myself what was going on with the instincts, because I had learned with the instincts, but they were considered just a minor factor, that the type was in charge, but you could use the energy of one of 3 instinctual types to transform fixated passions and beliefs into their holy virtues and ideas. But what I saw is that actually people wouldn't even necessarily show their true type until their instinct was triggered. And they didn't just show one instinct, they showed two really close, or even three, which I later called the stair-step pattern. So if we were to say I had a hypothesis, it would be that the instincts were far more significant than we understood. Now, as I'm sure you know, having studied with me at the time, there was nothing on that other than what Kathy had transmitted and other people had kind of interpreted, like Eli Jackson Bear or Helen Palmer, or other people that got the information by being in Berkeley and a part of a community that was very interested in self-awareness. But I put that aside and I just decided to take all the people who were at the level of certifying or were at advanced courses that I attended in that period from 1994 when I was at the conference to the early part of 1995 and sent out a questionnaire based on how people see themselves and what they'd say about the questions. And would I be able to see the instincts in the questions? Would it reveal anything more that I didn't know or anything more about the types? So I created the questionnaire. Now, what people don't know is that questionnaire is not just a simple questionnaire. It was created based on an intensive I took on how to interview people and get the most out of them in the shortest amount of time. And I did that because I'm fundamentally lazy and I didn't want to have to constantly hire people, place them, train them. Okay, they didn't work out, and hire someone else. So I had a vested interest in wanting to quickly ascertain if someone had the qualities that would fit a particular position. And because I had Denver West, including Hawaii and Alaska, that was a lot of travel that, I didn't want to do more than I had to. It's one thing traveling for fun. It's another thing traveling over and over again, doing something that's not as interesting. But I made it interesting by taking a course. And so the first 7 questions, the 5 adjectives, I guess 9 questions, greatest strength and greatest weakness and why, were a part of that. The people cannot, unless they know what you're doing and they try to pre-plan their answers, if they have to come from themselves rather than a multiple choice or an either or, they're going to come from their true defense strategy and focus of attention. Now, I have since had people that put in things as their own that actually I said about myself personally. So I know that they didn't, it didn't come from their inner self unless they've taken on an aspect of what I taught. And it's very easy for us to do. At first it was like, well, wait, that's what I said in that particular way. It isn't, a standard way of looking at things. So I began that and over 400 people responded. Now I did send a self-addressed, stamped envelope, everything. So they'd respond. We didn't have the email at that level. Not yet. People weren't on email. It was just beginning. And it was extraordinary. At first I sorted them by type, and then I sorted them by instinct, and I sorted them by wings and moved them around to see patterns. I naturally was fortunate enough to be born with an unusual level of pattern recognition. So I can visual. So I can quickly see a pattern. I actually can hear it, but if I see it and hear it, I remember it. And I could quickly go, oh, wait a minute. That person is answering exactly like the 9s that person's saying they're a 3.
Mhm.
And how is that so? How could someone use words like, I need to be comfortable, I'm laid back, I'm busy, which was the misunderstanding. And later, the person, of course, did have the tritype that included the 3 and the 7. So it's totally understandable. But there were too many words that the 9s were using. And when I compared her questionnaire to the 3s, no, the 3s didn't say anything like that. They were talking about their dynamic nature. They were talking about their professionalism, and some word talking about their execution, their excellence, their determination. Very different than laid back and an image of haphazard elegance. But haphazard elegance? So I started interviewing the 3s. Okay, what's your image? Tell me more about your image. And not one of them used that. I interviewed the people that didn't match their type. And sure enough, with further understanding, they realized they were another type. But they sincerely misunderstood. They thought if they were busy, they were a 3. If they were smart and shy and awkward, they were a 5. Many of the things that people have since learned. So that's how I got started. But the information then just spurred me on to continue. And the last research I did was in 2014, but I asked, I think, 81 questions. So I'm still getting through all that. But every study, and there have been 22 of them, included the instincts.
Yeah, that's actually perfect because it kind of leads into the Ennea style piece and the lexicon and the language. Your research inspired me to do my research as a communication scholar and expand upon your questionnaire. And I think I've had 1,800 people take it, and what you taught us about these the language that people use and the words people use, people think it's some sort of magic trick that it's not, it's these patterns. And so, we repeatedly have people be like, well, how did you know I was this type? Or how do you know I'm not this type? And it's like, well, you're not using the language that we've seen, with this type, or you're not describing yourself in the same way. And so that was really, I think groundbreaking in a lot of ways in terms of typing, because, it gave it typing kind of a qualitative structure and quantitative structure, really, to sort of be able to say, okay, well, let's look at how you see yourself and describe yourself, because that's really what ego is, on one level, right? So I'm glad you talked about that, because people don't understand, people think it's some sort of mysterious thing, right? That you can look at the word, even the words they use in their profiles on social media, you can glean a lot from how they present themselves.
So I once did a kind of there's a lot of things I want to say right now, but I once took a zip code in Chicago of people that were on match.com to see who goes on Match. Mm-hmm. It was very noteworthy that the socials were the most common, and the 6 with the 7 wing, or the 7 with the 6 wing, based on, by the way, what I'd learned after tens of thousands at that point of questionnaires. So as you know, you get to 1,800, it doesn't vary that much. If people truly answer like themselves, they don't ask someone, and they're not trying to trick the test, which one type in particular for some reason needs to do, even though they want the answer, became true. So then I took another area code and get all the match.coms, and sure enough, and then I got Florida. I thought that's about as different as from Chicago as you can get. Same thing. Now, all types were represented, but the way they filled out their profile, the 6s always had the word family and what they do for their family, social 6. in particular, the Prussian 6, according to Naranjo. But I guess what I didn't say is that when I took all those early results and the people I'd met over 9 years and had worked with, all my clients, all my friends, all my family, even my high school friends were exposed to the Enneagram. We were all talking about it. I began to see patterns of 3. And I didn't fully understand it. I'd heard it, I looked it up, and I thought, well, everything really with the Enneagram is built on 3. So I was trying to figure out subtleties, and I began to see with the interviews that people were choosing a type from each center. Now, if it was a type that was a wing, I thought, oh, it's a wing type. But when it was a wing type in a different center, like 8 with a 7 wing, and then the core, and I'm talking about the core fears actually in terms of choosing. And I had been collecting data on the types, and I had some very rudimentary tests. But the interview process, I had learned to go to the core fear of someone in terms of hiring them. So I was using that. And I had kind of grouped the core fears that people could have prior to ever learning about the Enneagram. And I had studied microexpressions and faciology and body language extensively before I came to the Enneagram, and many other typologies, including Myers-Briggs. So I was seeing patterns within patterns, and I just started saying, how could they have the core fears of the 3 or 4 if they were an 8 with a 7 wing? And then what would happen, why aren't they having the core fears of the 2? If it's a line of connection, or the 9 on the other side, but that would be double gut, right? But they didn't. They had the core fears from 3 different centers, many of which I could not explain. So I began to hypothesize that we use all 3 centers, and there are 3 centers. And if you go back to Gurdjieff, there's this 3-story man, I believed that we use all 3, but the order becomes significant. And then I hypothesized that the instincts, that we use all 3, not just one, and it's not secondary. And that research was pretty extensive, both in what people sent back to me, the qualitative research, but I also did a research study in 1998 that was with 2 other people, Kit Snyder and Victoria Ruderman, on the instincts and intimacy, and found indeed the same pattern. But prior to that, I hypothesized it and continued going. So I saw this pattern of 3 centers, 1 type within each center, 3 possibilities, and then Naranjo's 3 instinctual subtypes, which were a continuation. At that time, though, I did not know that the instinctual subtypes came from Naranjo. In 1995, I'm talking about. I assumed they came down through Ichazo and taught it that way. No one corrected me either, so I guess no one else knew it at that time. But I guess what I'm saying is that the stacking became very significant to me because I had already stacked the groups of fears based on my earlier work. I hadn't really thought about that, but
Right.
But there was no one to talk to about it. You guys weren't around, and the other people that knew enough about the Enneagram and diverse perspectives that saw the patterns just go, whatever you think, Katherine. And then when I was certifying, I asked people to I sent this questionnaire and asked people to send me words, pictures, and phrases of how they related to their type, in addition to filling out the questionnaire. And boy, those pictures came in, and I was like, whoa, yeah, this is even more validating than I ever understood.
Right.
And then I had people of the area that knew their Enneagram type, and there were many, come in and look at it. Now, for those of you who want to know, I didn't do the little cutting around the pictures on the collage. I just laid them out. That is not my nature. Small motor, not.
Yeah. No, I think it's noteworthy because you were seeing these patterns, of 3. Talk a little bit about why you distinguished your work from the trifix idea. Rika coming.
Oh, wonderful. Well, really what I need to say is that in 1996, Naranjo, after almost 24 years, came back and decided, I'm going to teach the Enneagram. And in that training, and I was lucky to get in, they were supposed to only have, I think, like 35 people, and there were, I think, over 75 people that were there. And so we were all crammed in, and I just said, hey, do you mind answering some questions? There's, I've studied with different teachers. I've certifying with 3 different, by that time, I guess I had. And there are different viewpoints. Will you clarify them? And he said, sure. So he answered the question that I had about not only the instincts, but I had done my research, and the publishers from Enneagram Monthly, Jack Labanuskas and Andrea Isaacs, had asked Naranjo if he would read my research and validate it or invalidate it, see if I was on the right track. I already had a chart and a lot of stuff out there before then, but it was another thing to just write what people said and collect everything that I learned. And he looked at my research and he was delighted. First, he kind of took it with, like, oh, isn't that nice? but he had read my work on Ennea styles, so he was intrigued. And he came back the next morning and he said, I want to talk to you. That's what he'd do, like this. And I said, oh, here it is. There are a bunch of mistakes out there. And he goes, I'd make one correction. I go, one correction? He said, yes, I'd use the word rigid in the social chart, not in the self-pres. And I said, why is that? He said, I think the self-pres people is quite rigid about needing things a certain way, a certain time. And he said, yes, they do. They're ritualistic. They like their routine. He said, but the socials are rigid. And I go, great, I'll change it. I go, what else? He goes, nothing. I'm flattered that you validated my work. I just said, oh, okay. And he said, after this week is over, I want you to write what you learn. I'm going to teach the 27 subtypes as I know them. And I want you to write it and put it in your book, the book that I gave him. I said, whoa, you want me to publish something you haven't published? And he said, yes, because you give attribution. I said, yeah, but I'm going to send it to you. I'm not going to just randomly publish something. I don't want any more errors, which leads to trying to answer your questions. It changed everything, actually, because once I knew that what I saw was meaningful and he felt it validated his work, which was especially important to him because people were not giving him attribution. That's why he stopped teaching. And he said he stopped publicly teaching in 73, although I know he did do some teachings in 74. I don't know if they were also private, and that's why he didn't consider them. But he got mad that people were taking credit for his work. And that's when he told me that he came up with the subtypes, but that they were based on Ichazo centers. Right. And then he told me actually later on, more about that if you want to go into it, of how the centers from Ichazo were instinctual triads, and they each proposed a fundamental question that the ego is trying to have answered, and a lot more to it. And when he left the Eureka training, the 10-month training, after 5 months, he then felt like he shouldn't use proto-analysis, instinctual triads, or the terminology Ichazo's come up with, and use like more accepted terminology, which is really important because that's a point of distinction of people not realizing what came from whom and when. But then in 2005, I also, well, in the meantime, I learned a lot about Ichazo from Naranjo as to what was Naranjo, what was Ichazo, and when. But it didn't land anywhere. I would discuss it with people and it'd be a nice conversation, but nobody really changed their teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And I just started teaching it the way I knew it to be because I had already had the hypothesis and others that Naranjo confirmed. So it wasn't hard for me to pull my clients and people that I taught the Enneagram to back together and say, all right, come to these, there were a couple of them, trainings at no cost, and I'm going to correct things that weren't understood, that were disseminated inaccurately. And there are quite a few, and some don't really matter as much, but some are really important. And because of that year on Maui, I had the good fortune of attending Ichazo's intensive too, and seeing the way he taught and what was important to him. And it was magnificent, actually, the way he would stay on a point, and then suddenly, once you understood the concepts, you could wrap around the types and the inner dimensions. So I really think you need Naranjo and Ichazo. And then later, as you know, he added Trifix.
Well, I mean, you touched on some really important things there. There's always so much packed
yeah, I kind of forget that, you know, it's evolving. And I didn't just spend a week in the intensive with Ichazo, but I also became friends with the teachers that Ichazo had designated to do his 40-day training, his 2-week domains of consciousness training, and his workshops and organizing different events. They weren't just ordinary people.
Right.
And they were able to really clarify, yeah, no, Ichazo never taught subtypes.
Right.
And you're right in your findings. That came later. And not only that, there were no fixations until after 1972. People think that the Enneagram as they know it was clearly in place, but it evolved. It evolved on Ichazo's end, it evolved on Naranjo's end. They merged for a short period of time, and very short, much shorter than we realize. And then they went their separate ways. And, you know, Ichazo later expanded on the term of trifix.
I was just going to add that what you're illustrating, which is what we've been sort of talking about a lot, is that the modern Enneagram of personality is disseminated from Ichazo and Naranjo, and you know, like you said, there was a brief merging, but that's where the initial sort of,
it's only 50 years old.
Right. And that it's evolving, but that there was a lot that got out there, which you touched on early on, that was, we'll touch on this a little later, but that was postulated about or written about, that was maybe a fleeting thought or a theory that got thrown out that then got printed and became, you know, Enneagram law. But yeah, what were you gonna?
I just really wanted people to like hear and realize that, you know, while Naranjo did talk about the subtypes, Some of them I think weren't as refined as others or weren't as fleshed out. And
Absolutely.
most of what we know now and what people teach and what's being passed around about the instinctual subtypes is based on your research. And, some teachers may not know that. And
Oh,
maybe some teachers have, added some of their stuff in or altered it. But a lot of it is really what we know from your research. And so that's something that I do want people to realize is that it didn't just materialize, and that it's based on research. It came from the types themselves and the subtypes,
and validated by the man that theorized it in the first place.
yeah, and which kind of shocked me on one hand. Another level, it made so much sense because a lot of the way I did the research was to take what other people had said, and people would hypothesize their type, and I would write down what types I thought they might be because I already could see how types mistyped as the other 8 types, and gave them the results and then asked them to check off the ones they identified and modify any way they wanted what was there, and then cross out what didn't apply to them and add what was missing. It was extraordinary. I thought I learned a lot of adjectives with the first questionnaire, and I did. Words at the time that weren't in the books that really hit on something important for the types. Because at that time, types were being told what they were through the assessment of really Naranjo's view, because he was the first to disseminate it beyond what later became Eureka, the original group that were in Eureka, Chile, the Eureka School. And he, that was his view. He wasn't literally interviewing each person. But when people were sending these back to me, I'm thinking they're not this type, they're crossed out everywhere. And then they're writing in the issues and concerns of another type. Done. But those that did agree with things but cross out a single word were noteworthy too. Like on the ones, there was an author that had used the word catastrophe all the time in her statements of teaching self-pres 1 and ones in general. And those ones, they crossed out that word catastrophe. And then when I interviewed them, I said, what is it you don't like about the word catastrophe? And they said, we don't have catastrophes. That would mean we hadn't prepared, we hadn't planned, we hadn't done due diligence. And they went on and on. I go, okay, got it. And then I said, well, what would you say instead? And they said, well, unavoidable circumstances or unfortunate circumstances, unfortunate consequences. And I go, well, what is an unfortunate consequence? And they said, it's a disaster we're not willing to look at. We don't even want to go there. Catastrophe is so far from our reality. And then I thought, okay, that's 3 or 4 people. Let me keep going. And it was across the board. Everyone I talked to, not just that I did interviews. I said, how do you feel about the difference between the word catastrophe and consequences? They go, are you kidding? And then they would explain it. They didn't quite say it like that. That's the way they would say it. But they went on to explain that. And I think that with the natural way in which we all have our own type, we teach from our type. And that was information written by 6. Catastrophe was interchangeable, right? Whereas the one thing I learned from that very early on was to not use my words, to use what the type said. And I had pages and pages and pages of the phrases that the types themselves use. And one of the hardest things I ever did was write the description of the types that you can get on katherinefauvre.com for each type, because it's my framework, but I had to put in the phrases and the way the types speak. And boy, is that hard if it's not your type.
Yeah, no, that it's really been key, that piece about describing and talking about the types the way that the language that they use. I mean, it's so simple, but it's really key to sort of understanding the types, because if it's all what we ascribe them to be, then we're projecting ourselves all over it. I mean, which we all do anyway.
Which is innocent and we could naturally do.
Right.
And I probably would have done.
Right.
If I hadn't had people be so specific. And I mean, the first hundreds and then thousands of responses, and I just carried on with that. I didn't want to stop, like a mad scientist. I am kind of a behavioral scientist by nature, even though I ended up having to deal with the jungle of the cosmetic industry, which wasn't, if you could survive that, you'd survive anything. But, and learning to be streetwise rather than a more traditional job.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted freedom more. I wanted to call my own shots, or I thought I called my own shots.
Say more about, you mentioned briefly going to Ichazo's training, and then we asked you earlier about trifix and tritype. Talk a bit about that distinction and how that came about. And
it's very important. Ichazo called them reunions, and what they were gatherings of the Eureka students that would gather every 5 years. And the ones earlier, I couldn't attend because I had always wanted to attend one, just to see what he was like in person, how he delivered the information. But the year that he happened to do it in 2005, I was living on Maui. And that's when I met his teachers, who then, of course, one was a sexual four, and he showed me everything he wasn't supposed to. And I knew everything that Ichazo was doing, but I kept that confidence. I'm telling you, but I didn't take that information and put it out there. And what happened is, I originally called these 3 stackings of the centers as 3 types and tricenter, just working with my clients and the few people that knew the Enneagram. But when I learned in 1996 that Ichazo was teaching the Eurekans that they had a trifix, and all I knew is that I was at a training where the IEA in Northern California was hosting an Eurekan on the movements, Ichazo's meditations and movements. And in that presentation, she was talking about her physicality, and she was a 5. And recently, Ichazo had said that she had also 8 in her trifix. And then she knew and described that visceral anger that moved through things and got her out of her head. And I go, whoa, trifix, wait, what's that? So I waited until the presentation was over, and I asked her, I said, I've been doing this research and I've seen that people have 3 types. What's trifix? And then she said, well, it's that you have 3 types, 1 in each center. And I said, wonderful. That's what I found. Where can I find more? And she said, well, there's nothing written. There is nothing more. We were just each told that we have three fixations, actually, not three types, three fixations. And that he had come to realize that there aren't just three fix, meaning three centers, with the centers fixation broken out to the three types fixations, that each one has that. And I said, amazing. And anything more you can tell me? And she said, no, we just use it in a clockwise order. So if you happen to be a 5, then she was a 5, 8, 3. And that if I was an 8, and my three types, which I thought were 8, 7, and 4, that it would be in that order. And now it happens to, 8, 4, 7, excuse me. But she said, I'm sorry, it's just, he doesn't really go into things the way you all do with the Enneagram. It's just more like he tells something and people take it because it's a spiritual school. It's not meant, you're not meant to, they have scholars. Believe me, in 2005, I met the people that were the few scholars that were predominantly 5s. And that was only because when I walked out of one of the presentations, he hadn't given us the rest of the types. It was a break, or the types yet. He was still at the 9 as being the beginning and the ending, but he hadn't said more. And I go, oh, okay, he's going to say this about the 1, the 2, the 3. And I was hypothesizing what he would say. And people looked at me with disgust. And they said, how could you possibly know what he's going to say? And I said, oh, well, I don't know. But based on these factors, it's highly probable. Right. And they said, well, you need to talk to the scholars. And I said, oh, great. I'd love to meet the scholars. And I said, you mean the average person in Eureka doesn't know all these, the mechanical and the whys? And they said, no, that's not what we're focused on. But there are the scholars who know. And like the, what would you call those? And the shamans of the shaman. So they said, well, it's possible that you could be on the right track, but we won't know till we get back. And I go, yeah. So of course, it's exactly where Ichazo went, because it's formulaic, in my opinion. Once you learn the formulas, you know the potential focus of attention and why, what emotional need is being triggered. So from the time forward of learning about trifix, I thought, okay, there's nothing out there, but Enneagram Monthly had published 2 paragraphs when they interviewed Ichazo on trifix, but there was nothing about the breakout or why or how or the dynamics. And I thought, well, I don't want to confuse people further with different names. And my 3 types and Tricenter were based on the same fundamental principle of having a type in each center, and that you have a way in which you use these. And I'll just give attribution to Ichazo as the pioneer and creator of the Enneagram of Personality, and just continue to find out more and share what I learned. And then after a few years, I said, yeah, I'm going to start just teaching the formal trainings to people who haven't said, hey, can you please teach this? There were a group of psychologists and coaches and therapists that said, I know people have more than one type. And I see it. The ego can't have just one. It's a dynamic principle. And will you please teach it? And I said, okay, I'll teach it publicly. So then I did. And one of Ichazo's Euricans on the board of directors came to the training incognito. And of course, I gave him attribution, and then everybody had their test. And then I told them what it revealed, because I had the Enne-style questionnaire that you've researched and added to, and I had the Enne cards test, and then what came together. And some patterns over time are just not random. And she was really struck by the fact that I didn't steal it from anybody. They were trying to think, what did I get that they didn't know about? And then she realized that it was a whole nother thing that I had found. And they had wanted to trademark some terms, which later they did trademark, trifix being one of them. But I had popularized it. The internet was an interesting thing. I had said trifix this, trifix that, trifix, trifix, trifix. So if they tried to trademark it, I could block it because I actually had already used it. And we could say that because of me, it was in the public domain. And they said, is there any way that he could keep the term trifix? Was I willing to surrender that term? And that he'd really appreciate it if he could have that term. I thought, it's not my term. I respect him. You know, I wouldn't even know about the Enneagram of personality if it hadn't been for him. And I go, yeah, I called it 3 types and tricenter just before I ever used the term trifix. And they said they really appreciated how I always gave attribution and validation and talked about what was my work and what was Ichazo's. But they said, what if you use the term tritype? And that they had talked about it and decided I was teaching the full type and dynamics that follow the law of 3 and trilectics, which is so critical for the Enneagram. If you don't understand trilectics, you can easily make mistakes. And I thought, done. I like tritype. I like it better than trifix because it isn't just the fixation, it's the passion, it's the way the gut center operates. You take all 3, and it isn't just a mild concept. You can see it. You can lay out the pattern. And so I immediately changed it and said, we're separating our work. And they also said, all the research you've done, people are going to think is from Ichazo, which is fine because you've done good work, but it isn't what he teaches. He doesn't know your information. It's what you've learned. And it would be better to separate it so that people know what came from your research and tens of thousands of interviews and questionnaires and Enneastyle answers, as well as the Enne card answers, and then the interviews, the qualitative interviews that I've continued to do throughout. So on that day, I think it was 2007 or 8, I think it was 2008, in that moment I changed it. I went home, it's now Tritype. And it wasn't a problem for me because I wanted him to have that associated with his name,
Right.
Trifix, just as I want my own information associated with me.
I'm glad you talked about the trialectic nature because, you know, sometimes people, if you don't understand, like you said, you don't understand the trialectic part, then you hear tritype and it seems like, well, why would you need that? But the system itself is based on 3s. It's the law of 3 and the law of 7.
Dynamic.
Right. And so and like anybody that's done counseling or worked with clients or coaching and working on the psychological ego level, you know that people are using more than just one.
Oh, we'd all be like done if we only had one coping
right. If we only had one defense strategy, we'd exhaust that pretty quickly. And so if the Enneagram system is truly dynamic and follows this law of 3 and law of 7, then it would logically follow that you would use a type in each center. Everything else is, you know, so.
Yeah, the Enneagram symbol represents movement in the universe, the divine and creation coming together and creating movement with the law of 1 or 0, however you want to look at it, the 1, right. And then breaking into the 3, and then the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7 is is the flow. So, but every type has access to 3 types. Their type and their wings, 3. Their type and their lines of connection, 3. The 3 subtypes, which are just a more subtle variation of their primary center, 3. That Naranjo said that anything that is in duality is not the Enneagram. It's, and that's why Ichazo coined the term trilectics, and he's now trademarked that term. But you can use it and give him attribution. I do all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I was going to tie in one of our questions to something you said earlier. You were talking about, how Ichazo used to kind of tell people what their character or their energy was, the impression that he got of them. So it was like, your ego cow or whatever. And then Naranjo kind of did something similar. And so I'm kind of just wondering, like, what's your understanding of how we got from, where people needed teachers to guide them and to see their fixation and their structure from the outside, to now people, this is kind of a common question we get, but people will say, you're not supposed to type other people. I mean, it's really damaging and it's hurtful and it messes with someone's journey. And so how did we get from that to the idea that we can't type?
Well, and also, which you'll probably fold in anyway, that because you mentioned proto-analysis and the
That's just where I was going to go.
Yeah, start there and then maybe build it out, because it's really key to understand.
Because what Ichazo was looking for is how you answer these fundamental questions that the ego, based on each center, is trying to resolve, trying to survive. And that's why he had the group, which we'd call the gut types, that were focused on conservation, and they had a historical ego, remembering where to go, like, okay, the plum trees are along this path at this time of year, or the ego that is trying to figure out who to be in relationship with and how they need to be to have rapport so that they're safe with others. And that's what we call the heart center. Then there were the types that were focused on, okay, I need to survive by figuring out what I need to know and learning what I need to know. And I can do that by befriending people like the 6 and the 7, or study, hide, and see how someone catches rabbits and they're really so successful in hunting. Or maybe we need to band together and go after the woolly mammoth together. And that's the head center. And he originally called it conservation, relation, and syntony, but people didn't really understand syntony in the way that he wanted. And so he changed it to adaptation, which means you're adapting to peers, to the person in front of you. That's why 6s is the center of the head center. Always say it depends, because they're not going to act the same way with each person. They're going to see what they're up against. And so, gosh, I could just go so many different directions.
Talk a little bit about how he used proto-analysis to identify people quickly, the way he used it, and the visual typing aspect, and what you've learned from that and into typing. And
okay, so in addition to tracking what people were talking about and behaving like, he noticed there were features, not so much the way they looked, although stereotypes did emerge of the Enneagram types, which were incomplete, by the way. They're great for stereotype, but they're not always accurate. And I'd also studied archetypes long before I met the Enneagram. So I had pretty quickly discovered that all 7 primary archetypes were in all 9 types, but that one particular archetype was attached to the Enneagram types, which caused a lot of mistypings, actually. But what Naranjo and learned from Ichazo, but didn't say, was that Ichazo looked at where the muscles were in the face and where the types carried tension. And it's fascinating to me because when I learned proto-analysis, boy, that matched microexpressions. It was not off, it was consistent. So like the 8s overuse the muscles used to create the face of disgust. And what Ichazo noticed is that 8s carry their tension here. You could see an 8 through here. If you didn't get this kind of attitude, even in a subtle way, it wasn't an 8. If they had a little happy face and they got bright-eyed, not an 8. And that the energy gets bigger, but it doesn't get hysterical, unless they're really over the top. I mean, you could have a tritype. So proto-analysis was Ichazo's way of looking at how the types can be seen, not just heard by their focus of attention. And he used to take a picture of people and magnify it up on a big screen and study where that tension was, you know, like I can't quite do it. Contempt.
Yes.
It looks stupid when I do. I look much better going, what? Than I am in showing contempt. And certain types show contempt more, certain types raise their eyebrow more, and you can have inner knowing, which is just like the muscles across the dominant eye moving like, yeah, I know, this is something I know. Or they can crystallize when they narrow in on something. And these are things that I saw in addition to what Ichazo saw and then Naranjo used, but he didn't tell people. But the Eurekaans were clear from the very beginning that only Ichazo determined someone's fixation based on having knowledge that other people did not. That you really had to know what he knew. And remember what I said earlier about the Eurekaans, they weren't studying the types per se, they were studying their own journey and trying to see what was in the way of their spiritual progress and their growth. And they might understand the types, but many of us are students of information that was incomplete. And Naranjo carried on with the same way of teaching in his Seekers After Truth. So after he left after 5 months of the 10-month training in 1971, he came back to Berkeley, and shortly thereafter, he started privately teaching the Enneagram. People had to sign a confidentiality agreement so that he would not interfere with Ichazo's work. And he determined, based on their language, based on their expressions, based on the way they moved, what he thought their type was. He didn't leave it up to them because he felt people don't have a 360-degree perspective of themselves, that all of us have things that we keep a secret from ourselves, literally, that we don't know about ourselves, and we identify with our self-image. And by the way, the Enneaspread, which is your dominant type in the first part of the test, is at EnneagramTritype.com, but is the person's image, which may or may not indicate their type, but it will allude to it by what isn't there is just as important as what is there. But my point being that to accurately discern your type, you need others. and you need trusted others that are knowledgeable. And sometimes when I'm typing people, I'm just giving them the types to look at and the types to begin to self-observe, because it is observable. And if you get out of your own way, you can begin to see what you do. Along came a belief that stemmed from those that were sixes and did not want to have the burden of typing incorrectly or being like an overlord saying the way someone was. Well, that energy created a belief that everyone should find their own. And whereas I support people in the discovery process, without guidance, it's a tragedy, because people can miss years of knowing their lead type. Now, Tritype is such that people usually get 2 of the 3. Sometimes they don't. But if you don't know that lead strategy, you suffer and feel inadequate, because that's what the ego will do if they're not doing what their type should do. So if they're told or they believe they're a 7, but they're really a 6, then they're a failed 7. And it's anxiety producing. And they feel ashamed of their anxiety. Whereas with guidance, 6s can begin to realize that to recognize the 6, you have to look at what they don't say, they don't do, not just what they do. And it lifts the intent of the superego coming in and then saying, you have to form and fit into this type. So I believe in guidance, but I believe it has to come from someone that has studied beyond just the types descriptions. You have to know the inner workings of the types. You have to know the particular energies that are created. And what I loved about Naranjo's work is by adding the subtype focus, which was a fundamental fear regarding survival, with the ego fear of the type, you get a very specific focus of attention that leads the rest of your defense strategy. But that Tritype is just as important as the subtypes, because they're looking at, okay, stacking of these 3 ego types on the center and these 3 fundamental ways of surviving. And that when you put them together, you know exactly what the defense strategy will focus on and why, and you can begin to interrupt it. And it will produce the behavior. The problem is that many people can behave in the same way if they're stressed, but what is triggering that stress is dramatically different. And you can't begin to change and interrupt that process if you don't know the triggering force. You're only looking at, oh, I fired the gun, I got to stop that. Well, who can stop it if they don't know the buildup that's happening on an unconscious level? But we can begin to interrupt that if we accurately type. If we haven't accurately typed, it's like when people in 1996 did not know about subtype. You just miss a dimension that is part of the visceral defense strategy. And I don't propose Ichazo or Naranjo, and I greatly admire what other teachers have brought. I'm not negating anyone's interpretation, but I believe that it all needs to be together. That what Ichazo added, what Naranjo added, needs to come back together because it's observable. Yeah. And as you found, you can see it in people's results. You can see it. I can see it in the way people book appointments, the way they check on their appointment, the way they double check on their appointment, the way they don't check what they say after the appointment. And it's a process. And I believe people need to be allowed to have the time to have that process. But if they're not at least told to consider certain factors, none of us will do it. Our egos have no use in considering things we don't want to consider, that our superego is deemed would be embarrassing or reveal something that we don't want others to know.
Yeah, you touched on another thing that's really important, in that we grew up in the Enneagram world on message boards and the internet, and there's a lot of people coming to the Enneagram now as it's kind of having another renaissance period, where they're finding it through Instagram or through YouTube or Facebook groups or other forums, which is great because it's spread and there's a whole new generation of people coming up. But there's a danger in that it people aren't getting the experiential piece. I mean, they're getting it on a on the internet level, but you're not seeing the types at work. You're not hearing it from their mouths. You're not seeing the micro expressions and the archetypes coming together and learning it from somebody who has a knowledgeable teacher. And we're not guru people, but it's really important to learn it from somebody that's
the subtlety gets lost on the internet. So people without needing to end up typing just on stereotypes or behaviors, which as we know, leads people astray.
Yeah, it really does. Like in the era before mine, you went with a particular teaching. And then I was probably the first person that went and studied with everybody. But as an aide, I wanted the information for myself and not just one viewpoint. And as I said, I learned wonderful things with each certification, each teaching, each course. But I could quickly see what was missed. And in your era, the good thing is that you were exposed to different teachings. There was no conference till 1994. So you couldn't get all of them at once. And then the dilemma with your era were the message boards. And there were a whole group of people that had read things that were, by the way, a lot of it incorrect. And they were telling people what type they were. Now, I disagree with that. I think that does hurt people. Now, if someone says, what type should I look at? And someone says, well, based on what I know, I would consider this type, and this type, or these two types. I have no problem with that. But typing someone and belittling them in any way, I'm totally against. I'm talking about guidance from someone who's actually not only read the information, but attended real courses, seen people in real time that are those types, and people mistyped and what it looks like, and knows things deeply rather than on the surface. So it's distressing to me when people come to me and they've been told they're a type based on someone that has never even attended a workshop or even an online workshop.
Yeah.
Right.
It's all come from people who agree with one another coming together and saying what type someone is.
And based on stereotypes.
Yes. And they don't know what they don't know, which is the tragedy. But people who really want to know eventually continue on. But it's hard. And I have to say that I agree with not hurting people by telling them their type. I absolutely disagree with people not giving guidance if they're qualified to do so.
Right. Yeah. It's having the knowledge and the correct knowledge and doing the work. I mean, I read every Enneagram book that I could get my hands on for years. We both did, but it wasn't until we started with conferences and then started studying. We went to quite a few things that Tom Condon did and that Russ did, and we went to some Helen Palmer things. So we got teachings from but we gravitated to your work because you'd already done all that that pulled it together.
I liked all their work,
right.
and more.
Right, and more, but it wasn't until we went to intensives, where with you and worked with our type and other people and saw it and got kind of full downloads that things started to click. And even 20 years later, it's just now starting to kind of crystallize for us in a way where we feel like have a sense of mastery over it. And it almost takes at least that long to me, for most people to get, maybe now it can be a little bit accelerated because of the internet and the way information, but still, I think it's a discipline that takes study. And even with, we share your pattern kind of recognition abilities, even with that, you still have to learn what you don't know. Right. And it's such an important piece of.
I mean, even when we met you in 2008, we had been studying the Enneagram for 8 years, and we thought we knew everything.
Right.
Right. And we were like, we're so good at this. And sometimes, you would say what type you thought a celebrity was, and we're like,
you would ask me, and then I would tell you, and you'd be.
Yeah, we're like, okay, like we knew. And of course now I'm like, we knew really nothing.
Yeah.
Like we just
you knew a lot. But those distinguishing factors of what happens when 3 types come together. Like a lot of people think, oh, I just need to know my type in each center. Yeah, no. It's what happens when those 3 types come together. What do they create? What do they cancel out and ignore? What's amplified? And then the subtypes, the same thing. You're having the type and the 3 types and the 3 subtypes coming together, creating, again, canceling or amplifying. So that's what I had the benefit of. That takes time. But once you learn these different factors, the centers, the types, the tritypes, and the instincts, the 3 instincts, and how they come together, then it's really becomes very obvious. There are the archetypes that Naranjo was seeing. He just hadn't filled them all out. And that's why he didn't feel qualified to write a book until later.
Right.
But in 1996, he felt he hadn't seen enough.
Right.
That he was introduced to at the time I'm thinking, yeah, you're just humble. You're just a 5 that doesn't know enough yet. But now, and later when I talked to him, I believed him because I know what it's like to miss an archetype. Like when I did my studies, I got what people who knew the Enneagram thought they were. But then I thought, well, gee, what happens with people who know nothing about the Enneagram, would never touch the Enneagram, would never answer a questionnaire unless I just talked them into it, persuaded them. So I got all types of people to do it based on knowing me. That wasn't always easy sometimes, but I got those SJs and the Enneagram 8s and 3s that did not want to fill out questionnaires, or the 6s that didn't want to be typecast. I just went in search of them to find out what they would say. And then I could clearly see the patterns. So if you read what happens with the sexual 4 and why they feel hatred, all human beings feel hatred. It's just that 4 is positioned to track and to know what matters to them based on hatred. It's like their fuel, their accelerant. What makes them go against a scenario and go after the exclusive elite information that they need for their ego to calm down and be productive. It isn't just like, oh yeah, 4s hate and no one else does. It's all human beings do, but we all get hooked on some, and that's what Naranjo was pointing out.
Yeah.
In his terminology, and I added to it, but from people sharing, like the self-pres 6, she was just taught the warm 6, meaning you're warm at first because you're checking out whether someone's a potential threat. But if the self-pres 6 likes you, they're very affectionate.
Yeah.
But if you betray them or misinform them, boy, you are rejected. And when I first wrote that rejection, because it came from the self-pres 6s, people go, whoa, yep, it's true. Just that quick, the 6s would say, warm, affection, rejection. Yeah. Because the defense strategy has to. You're a threat.
Right.
Whatever you said has to be pushed out. I mean, you could say it better, Aaron, but
no, I mean, it there's so many nuances and details that you can't learn unless you, it kind of leads us to the other thing we've been working overtime to debunk, which is the integration disintegration piece. I've seen a video of Naranjo teaching a workshop that's out there for public consumption that it's a 10-hour workshop, and he's talking about the subtypes, but in it he spends about 20-30 minutes talking about, like you said, people stealing his work and why he stopped teaching, and why he was just disgusted with that. And one of the things he talks about is integration and disintegration. So talk a little bit about your understanding of that, and why, even from your own research, you found that it didn't always work the way that popular literature says that it works. So
yes, like I should just add before I go further is that Eureka does not teach integration disintegration in terms of one type going one direction and one the other. So nothing came down that way. And Naranjo did not put in his books integration or disintegration. And I just happened to notice when working with people the 9 years before I did the formal research is that I would see people doing good things or really meaningful things that would be considered their line of disintegration. That's when it first showed up for me. Or people would say, well, Katherine, in your system with the head center, you sure you're not a 5? Because look at how you go after the information, and that's not you disintegrating. That's you going and gathering information and sharing it with others. And obviously, the 7 winger, if we want to include Tritype, I have 7. So yeah, 5 is a line of connection. There's no question. But I do it totally like an 8-7. I throw out the information, then you give it back to me, and then I distill it down and I throw it out again. I'm not painstakingly coming up with one hypothesis after another and proving it or disproving it. I'm not a 5. I'm trying to find out what I don't know. And we need both types of work, and there are many types of research, but with integration disintegration, I couldn't help but notice, wait, that's also the person's integration point. And they had 2, like an 8 has a line to 2, then why are they acting so needy? And they're obviously not taking care of themselves, so others are going to fill that void and feel like they need to take care of them. Even if the 8 pushes it out and doesn't want it, it still creates a type of vacuum. And I could see that with every single type. I could see the positive and negative of both lines of connection. So one of my early questions with Naranjo in 1996 was, oh, why do I see both? And he said, oh, well, that was an error. I've written it many times, but it's a misunderstanding. But it was also, he said things were attributed to it that he never said. But he did say that in a study group with Seekers After Truth in Berkeley, in that first year of teaching after Ichazo, learning the Enneagram, that he would take ideas of what he already knew in his training, and he was part of the consciousness movement from the very beginning. He may have been a psychiatrist, but he taught at Esalen and was very attached to doing personal work. It wasn't just theoretical. But the theoretical part of 5, he said he'd throw an idea against the wall like spaghetti, and what stuck was true. So he always was hypothesizing this or that or the other thing. And that in one group, he thought, with the arrows, what if we looked at the arrows in a more continuous way, not the way we know the arrows in general, just the law of 3 and 7 and 0 coming together. He said, perhaps it's easier to go one way and to fall into our negative qualities and harder to move into our positive qualities. And maybe it has to do with the direction, that we could have 2 directions of the arrows. And there are. We can always use both directions of the arrows. And he thought, maybe. And they discussed it in the study group. And he said, no, that doesn't work because the Enneagram's a trilectic system of 3, and this makes it a dialectic system, so it doesn't work. Because you see, it isn't the line of connection. You never stop being your type. Your type is always going like a combustion engine. They're not going to each other. So my 5 and 2, maybe if I had that tritype, they're always operating, but they're always going back to the lead type. It is, you don't become the other type. And people unfortunately misunderstood that and thought they become the other type. And Robert Oakes was in that training. And Naranjo gave him permission to teach the Enneagram because he was very curious. The Jesuits were very scholarly, and he said he was very curious to see what they would do with it. And they promptly sent it out through the Catholic pipeline. And he hadn't fully sussed out the instincts, so they didn't disseminate the instincts, because that came later. That came in the next year and more experience. And he had a couple, but like Patrick O'Leary, who was one of the 3 authors in the original book, said that he learned the Enneagram from someone who learned from Oakes, just as Don Riso did, a teacher upon a teacher upon a teacher, because it just was disseminated unbelievably effectively all over. And so people who didn't really know, had never studied with Ichazo or Naranjo, were then teaching the formula. And Robert Oakes liked the formula, according to Naranjo, that you could work with your sin and redemption by recognizing this pattern. So I would hypothesize that if you like that pattern, you can still work with it. You just look at the high side, the redemption of the high side of both types in your line of connection, which really still your type and your tritype. And the way we sin or miss the mark is still both types. And then we can begin to see our true type and our accurate typing. Does that answer that? It was just, and then it was, once it was disseminated, it was like done. And I did it, I taught it myself, by the way. I had to go back and unteach it. And I told everyone that Naranjo said it was an error, but people had already in a way discovered that there was more to it, and they would find ways to have the high side of their disintegration point have these qualities, and it's what you want to aspire to. So no one would have done that if they hadn't also seen what I saw. And I was in a training, and a yearly training that Helen and David would have, where Enneagram teachers would get together, and then we would share with each other, and then Helen and David would share some viewpoint that they had once a year. It was amazing. It was a lot of fun. And there was someone where I was trying to talk about what I'd learned, and she goes, "Oh yeah, I've always seen that people go to both." And so I've called it, the inner child. And what I found fascinating, though, in a study of peer relating, is that people who knew that Naranjo had said that wasn't true did not publish for many years because they had signed the confidentiality agreement. And the one person who did not was his girlfriend, which was Kathy Speed. So she disseminated the Enneagram and taught courses at ITP, which was for transpersonal psychology in California. It's changed a number of times. But she came to add some qualities of that herself, but it wasn't in her original notes. And other teachers that were there added aspects of it. And I thought, wow, peer pressure is intense. If the Enneagram is known to include that factor, then they must feel pressured to carry on that. Because there were, very successful books written with stress and security, integration, disintegration, and so on. So that amazed me, that when I knew that those people had been told, according to Naranjo, now maybe he was wrong. I have to always say maybe he was telling me something untrue. But he was puzzled by it. Like, they know I said it didn't work that way, that the type would have to always be going to both. So you tell me.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll say it. I think people don't want to, I know you're being appropriate. I think people just don't want to go back and correct themselves because they don't want to be wrong. And unfortunately, it's damaging to, the Enneagram at large, because it's hard to, for some people, a dogma is created, right? And unfortunately, that dogma has already been debunked. So
it's also a really great escape for people that need to be a certain type.
Yeah.
True.
So someone can say, well, I'm a 2, but I'm really using my line to 8. And when really it could just be that that's part of 2.
Right.
Or that they're, a 6.
Right.
And it's like bringing in qualities that they see in themselves, but it's also a way for people to get around seeing their real, ego structures. So
I always even before we knew that integration disintegration wasn't really
it was incomplete. You see, it's not part of it. Half of it was right. It's not that complicated. People only have to add the positive and negative of both. You don't have to take away what's there. You just add in what was not disseminated.
Right. And but when people go into these really, really complex, explanations for things, the Enneagram actually, yes, it can be as complicated as you want it to be, but at its core, it's a very elegant system, especially when you think about it in threes. And I like your description of and recollection of what Naranjo said, is that it has to be trilectic. So, it has to include your type and both ways, and they're running all the time like a piston. But yeah, it's that's one of those things we still kind of come up against. And I think when we usually phrase it as, well, you're using both lines.
At all times.
At all times, right.
I mean, just oscillating, and you're using your tritype.
Right.
It's not like, okay, stop.
Right. Right.
Like the machinery that's not a piston. A piston's going up and down at a rapid speed, but machinery where they're going, it's not like that. We're not stopping and saying, oh, I'm going to move to my line of 2. I'm happy. I'm going to move towards people.
Right.
Oh, I'm unhappy. I'm going to move away.
Right.
I love Karen Horney's work, as did Naranjo, but her work was incomplete too. She kind of lumped 3s, 7s, and 8s together in a way that made it so we could see them as moving against. But a lot of her work didn't explain the different ways that people can move towards and move away. You can say, yeah, sure, and move away, or you can just recede into the wallpaper. Can I say something more?
Sure. Yeah.
Sterlin, you have your PhD, and Aaron, you have a double master's, and that whatever you thought you knew at graduate level, graduating from high school or graduating from college, that there was always more to learn. And I can't stress enough that people need to know the Enneagram at that level to really consider themselves a master teacher. Just having one school of thought or hearing something and liking the idea, it's good. I did it. I was teaching after a few months. I have no excuse, but I didn't fully understand the inner dynamics of the types and their deep suffering, and that these constructs mentally, or the behaviors physically, and the emotions that were repeated because it was safer than no emotion, until I understand this dynamic of the 3 and leading from the primary point, because you never stop having that point. And even when we become healthy, you're still going to have the defense strategy of a 4-7-8. I'm still going to have the defense strategy of an 8-7-4. And Aaron, you're still going to have the defense strategy of a 6-1-4. You just are. And our instinct is going to turn that machine on, whether we like it or not. But we can choose to see the machinery because we know what the machinery is. If we've mistyped, we don't know what machines have been turned on. So we don't know how to turn them off and have a different viewpoint. So I respect you guys. I have seen you, you knew a phenomenal amount, by the way, from the very beginning, because you had studied the works of many different teachings. And so it was just a question of integrating what I had learned from different teachers.
Right.
And then seeing it for yourself, which is why I've always loved that you do your own evaluations and studies.
Yeah, I mean, it was invaluable to us. And it really, I mean, one of the things I've always appreciated and respected about your work is that you actually do research with actual people. You check it out. It's not heuristic, right? It's not just, I'm going to imagine that this is what it would be. And that's how hypotheses start out. But, then you move into, well, let's check it out. And that's
true.
Right. You have to check it out. And as we did a lot of school and part of especially grad school is like, you have to do your research and you have to gather the data and only then can you say, okay, I've seen this pattern enough times that, and then also staying open, right?
Staying open.
Exceptions to the rule. And it happens. But one of the beautiful things, I guess, about the universe is that these patterns are, once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them, right? And so, and that's what we've been.
Like if you see someone as kind of laid back and sleepy, you can never see them industrious again because you're aware of it. If you see them as energetic and someone says, "Oh, that person's laid back," you're going to say, "Actually, no, I don't see them that way." Once we become aware of something and see it, we can't unsee it. And that was my problem. I could have gone with one school or another and done quite well, but I could not unsee what I learned from the other schools, the other trainings, and from my research. And I just had to take the lonely path of teaching what I learned instead.
Well, thank you so much. This has been extremely illuminating. And we're glad that you were able to speak from your experience of working in this field for so long and doing so much research. And your contributions are, I think people don't realize that a lot of what's out there about the Enneagram came from work that you did. Because you've been pretty humble about that, but the instincts and Tritype and all of that, you really help to advance a lot of that. And so, we really appreciate the work you're doing. We've always appreciated the work you're doing, but the work you're doing now to kind of to correct the errors in the transmission, because that's what inspired us to start Empathy Architects and continue that work as well. So
I think we all have a passion for finding the truth.
Yeah, and for helping people to not suffer needlessly. Like that was one thing that Naranjo said to me, that with integration, disintegration, he said it was a tragedy. And I really had never heard him use that word before. And he said it was a tragedy, that it was disseminated incorrectly because it caused needless mistypings. Actually, he said needless suffering due to mistypings. And I certainly found and have always found that when people get to me and they've mistyped, there is a lot of suffering and rigid thinking, because the ego just says, okay, now I have to be this. It just wants an answer and it doesn't like the confusion. So yeah, it really impacted me when he said that. And he said something, he's very nonchalant. If you've seen him on videos, it's like, even if he's saying he's unhappy about something, it seems kind of understated, where I could say the tiniest comment and it seems like absolute and definite. But he didn't start telling the truth till 2010. He very much wanted to, told me, protect his relationship with Ichazo, as Ichazo being his teacher, long after the time that Ichazo was in communication with him and acting as a teacher. Mm-hmm. But then in 2010, you can find videos and interviews where he's talking about this, as you said, and he published it in a book in 1994. He said it in the training I was in, not just to me, but to everyone in attendance. So if people don't ask, he didn't answer the questions. If they asked, he answered. So yeah. They can find it elsewhere. The book is Enneagram Types in Psychotherapy, published in 1994. He has a piece in there. And I didn't meet him in person until 96, so that had been out for 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, people don't realize, just brief, we had a post that we ended up taking down because people misinterpreted it about, the types and personality disorder diagnoses and the correlations. And people were like, just flipped out, because we didn't do enough explanation, which I take responsibility for. But people didn't realize this. It wasn't us. I mean, if you know the DSM, you can.
Naranjo did that. He clustered.
Naranjo did that work. Yeah, he's a psychiatrist.
Yeah, he was a psychiatrist, and he saw these clusters. It's not that he was saying you're going to have this disorder. He did say that anybody can have any disorder, but they clustered in this way. So yes, I had it on all my forms too in the 80s and the 90s. And then I decided, yeah, this isn't helpful. People grab it.
Yeah.
And then they start calling people whatever. But people are going to do that anyhow.
Right.
Like sometimes people ask me, well, doesn't this system typecast people and hurt them? I go, no, it's a tool. It's simply a tool. It's not a religion. It's not a belief. It's a tool for seeing what's in the way of what you don't see about your spiritual journey, which could be very simple or very complex. You could be devoted to that spiritual journey or just be a kind and spiritual person that believes in universal love and truth and never pursue it further. But a lot of people have taken it like this almost weapon. Mm-hmm. They weaponize it, yeah. But they will weaponize whatever they're given. It's just a tool.
Yeah. Yeah. But, and making it a belief system, like you said, or an ideology or
dogma with the dogma.
Yeah. And you know, I had Naranjo's book back when we were in undergrad, and of course I didn't fully understand it. He has a very particular way of writing.
You almost had to see him in person.
Yes, and I can appreciate it now. I've gone back and read it a few times, but you know, I agree with him in that he saw the types as, you know, they were ego fixations and distortions, and they're great gifts that come from that. We need them all, but fundamentally they are, you know, neurotic in nature because they get fixated in a particular, and I think people kind of misunderstand sometimes when you approach it from that perspective and saying, I love it when you say, you know, we're all a mess, and we're all a mess, and we all have great gifts, and you have to be able to recognize the ways in which you're a mess.
Yeah, it's what kind of mess are you? I'm this
making, right. So that then you can access those gifts more easily, get out of your own way, you know. So yeah.
Well, Naranjo said that he goes, why should I write about the gifts? It's the pathology that's in the way. The gifts are fine. Right. I go, all right, I got it. But he saw no need to write about the gifts.
Right.
That he was more interested in the pathology that was obstructing those gifts. Yes. He cracked me up. But it's a fascinating man. I liked him very, very much.
Well, thank you. I think we covered all of our major questions, and we'll have to do this again because I think it was very illuminating. And there's always things, you know, as we've seen, you know, we've been here for, I don't even know how long it's been. I lose track of time. But there's always more, right? And it's such a deep and interesting history. And I think people need to know that the modern history of how it was disseminated. And I think that's gotten lost. And I know you've done a lot lately to kind of clear those things up. So for those of you that are watching, you can find Katherine Fauvre on her website, katherinefauvre.com, and us at empathyarchitects.com. I just really appreciate it because it's so important for us to get this out there and clear things up. So thank you very much.
And it was the 4s and 6s that gave me all the information they shouldn't have.
Of course.
Yeah. Well, what I have done without the 4s and 6s and 7s.
Yes.
Throw some, well, I have this or this or this.
Right. Throw it in there. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
We will see you next time.
You sure will. Goodbye.